This is the PS5 you should look for. So as you guys have heard over the past few weeks, Sony has released a new PS5, and Austin, Ken who's over there, and I just took apart every version of the PS5, and what did we find?
It's a whole lot different on the inside. The heatsink, the complete layout of everything, the weight. But you know what? I don't think I am PS ready enough to handle this. Could you take over?
Yeah, for sure.
I gotta go finish my video.
All right, see ya.
Just explain, good, not good, great.
Great. This is the great one. If you want to get the new PS5 as soon as it's available, make sure you use the links down in the description. I have also literally any PS5 accessory you can think of linked there as well. So if you need anything new for your PS5, buy it with those links. So as Austin kind of let you guys in on, we have all three versions of the PS5 here. There are actually 6 versions if you count the disc edition of the PS5, but these are 3 digital models. We have the 1000, which is the launch model. We have the 1100, which is the one Austin and I took a look at last year, and then we have the 1200, which is the new one. We had it shipped here overnight from Australia, and I was definitely expecting obviously some internal changes just because we saw how much lighter it is. The disc edition is 300 grams lighter, this one is 200 grams lighter, but I really wasn't expecting it to be as changed as it was. So the easiest way to see how different the internals of the new PS5 are is to compare it to the original one. So just look how much bigger the heatsink is as a whole on this original PS5 motherboard. This is the new one, by the way, if you couldn't tell just from the insane difference. There is a lot more copper being used here, which is a lot more expensive, and that's basically the goal here, cost cutting. They also majorly condensed the actual size of the motherboard itself, like the PCB. There's this like gray aluminum, I don't know, metal shield over the PCB, but if you compare even this PCB to the original, you can see how much different it is. They've cut off like a whole quarter of it essentially, and they've even condensed things like the CMOS battery, which now lives underneath the heatsink. It's like hard to see. I'm pointing at it, you're not gonna be able to see it. And they also moved the Wi-Fi chip to make it on this board. Another cool minor thing I noticed is that there's a little bit more support for the HDMI port, which is good because that's a big issue that the PS5 has been having. The soldering on a lot of the HDMI ports hasn't been great, and just plugging the thing in once or twice is enough to break it on some launch models. So to see them taking that feedback and fixing that up, that's good in my opinion. I'm just gonna cut right to the chase here on this thing. I think Sony is getting ready for the PS5 Slim with this new version of the PS5, and there's a few reasons for that. I already mentioned how much smaller the motherboard is. It's so much smaller to the point where you could have made this PS5 smaller, but they have all of these extra pieces on here to make it fit inside the current chassis. But if they wanted to rework the actual chassis of the PS5, they could use this as a good starting point to make the overall thing smaller, just because you needed that extra space on this original motherboard. Like, you can see how much bigger the actual heatsink is. They have reduced it so much more in this new model. Then there's the major factor that this PS5, the 1200 model, uses 20 less watts of power than both the 1100 and the 1000 model. It's using less power, which also results in it running a lot cooler than those other two models as well. And so when I was talking to Austin about it, basically his theory is that there's a new chip inside of here, or a like revised chip compared to the one that we had in the original PS5 and then the 1100. That kind of makes sense to me, and if this is a new chip, I don't think this is the exact one we'll see in the PS5 Slim. It just seems like a cool little sly way for Sony to test some new ideas they have with the hardware, get it out into the wild, and make the current PS5 cheaper to produce as a whole. And that's really the entire goal here. This isn't a new thing. Like with every PlayStation console, there have been multiple editions. I remember with the PSP, before they even got to the PSP 2000, there were multiple versions of that PSP 1000, just like we're seeing with the PS5. I'm sure if you looked at the PS2, the PS3, or even the PS4, you'd see the exact same thing across the board with all of those devices, and the same thing extends to Xbox and Nintendo. I mean, this was kind of a controversy, but Nintendo released a new version of the Nintendo Switch that had much better battery life than the original, and they didn't really even announce the change that they made, which is why you don't see Sony announcing this change here. So there's a lot of stuff going on at Sony right now internally between this PS5 coming out, the price of the PS5 as a whole raising pretty much everywhere around the world except the United States, and the chief architect, like the guy who designed the PS5, the PS4, the PS4 Slim, the PS4 Pro, and I'm pretty sure going all the way back to the PSP, he is leaving the company. But because they work so far ahead on these consoles, I I don't think we'll see the last of his work until at least the PS5 Pro. I doubt they're far enough ahead to be working on the PS6. If they are, it's in the drawing board stages. But I don't think really we have much to worry about with the PS5's design, because as we've seen, they've not only decreased the actual size of the heatsink and not really seen any performance degradation, which is good, they've also reduced it so much that they could just make a PS5 Slim right now and release it into the wild. The one big caveat with this new version of the PS5 though is that it was a lot harder to take apart than either the launch model or the 1100. I'm gonna say the 1100 was definitely the easiest to take apart of the three, which was kind of surprising. I'm the one who took that apart, and I am by no means a master at disassembling PS5s, but I was just able to take out a few screws, and then the whole motherboard just basically fell out of the machine. Ken had a little bit of an issue with the 1000 model where the motherboard wasn't really coming out as easy, but overall it seemed to be a little bit closer to on par with the 1100 model. That is not the case with this 1200 model. Austin had to take out a ton of screws. He had to use a lot more force to get it out of the chassis. It looks like there's a lot more connectors to worry about. Overall, that's going to make it a little bit harder to repair this thing yourself if you ever find yourself in a situation where you're out of warranty and you think something broke like the Wi-Fi chip, or you need to install a new CMOS battery. That is going to be much harder to get to on this PS5 because, like I mentioned earlier, that battery is hidden underneath the actual heatsink now, which is bad because, as we've seen, PS4s and maybe even PS5s will stop working allegedly if their CMOS battery goes dead, because there's like an internal clock in the battery that needs to check the internet and make sure that the clock is synced, and that's how their DRM works. I don't fully understand it. I just know that eventually a lot of people are going to have to change these batteries to be able to play their games, and it's going to be a lot harder on this new version of the PS5. We also weighed all of the power supplies on these PS5s, and they are exactly the same, so nothing changed there. Where you're going to see another big change though is with the actual like chassis of this new PS5. The 1200 model, it has these plastic like risers here, and I think there's one back here that the other two models don't have, and I'm assuming that's because they made this motherboard so much smaller. They had to give it a lot more support to keep it like steady inside this PlayStation 5, because this chassis is officially too big for this motherboard, which is kind of cool. Now, my thought on whether or not you should be checking the box of every PS5 you find in the store, if you manage to find one, just to see which version it is between the 1000, the 1100, and the 1200, that's taking it just a little too far, because as we've seen, despite the fact that the 1100 runs a little bit hotter, it didn't really affect the performance of the PS5 in any real way, other than the air coming out the back was a little bit hotter on this one than the 1000 model. But now that we have this one that runs with 20 watts less of power and is also smaller, I don't know. I feel like this one is probably worth keeping an eye out for, because this is going to be the most updated design, and also it was running overall cooler than the 1100 model. So even though this thing running hotter didn't actually seem to affect how it was running games, we don't know if overall it's going to affect the overall life cycle length of this PS5. Like, this one could crap out a lot sooner than the 1000 model, and we won't know, because thankfully Sony did a good job with the PS5, and they seem to be pretty reliable for most of the people who buy them. But all that being said, having one that runs cooler and also uses less power, those are net positives across the board, and it just seems like it's a more efficient console. So if you're in the situation where you have the option to look at the serial number or the model number of the PS5, like by being able to check the box, I would say try your best to get this new model of the PS5, because it really does seem like a big improvement over both the launch model and the 1100 model that we got last year. We also booted all of these up and played Astro's Playroom on them. The setup process for the 1200 was identical to the setup process for my launch PS5 at home. I did not notice it running any faster or slower than my PS5 at home. So yeah, I don't think you're really losing out on much of anything by them reducing the motherboard this much, other than the fact of the gains you're getting with that less power usage and also running cooler. And if you're one of those people out there who's like totally content with your PS4 Pro, or maybe you have an Xbox as well or a PC, it might be worth just waiting for the PS5 Slim and Pro at this point, because they are obviously getting closer and closer to that PS5 Slim release. I mean, I don't know how you can look at this thing and compare it to the original one and say that they're not trying to make this the PS5 Slim without really saying it. This feels like on par with when Nintendo released that Switch that I was just talking about, where the battery life was so much better. So if you guys remember, a long time ago, like 2 whole years ago when the PS5 launched, there was a big controversy because they were using different fans in different PS5s and it was totally random. Like it wasn't like the disc edition was getting one fan and the digital edition was getting another. It was like completely across the board. You had a totally random chance of getting a different fan. And the reason people cared about this was that one fan was running louder than the other fan, which is a legitimate fear for PS5 users because if you remember back to the PS4 generation, whether you had the PS4, the PS4 Slim, or the PS4 Pro, those things started sounding like jets taking off of aircraft carriers and there was really nothing you could do about it. Like even dusting them out, it still seemed like once they started getting loud, they stayed loud. So I understood at the time why people were worried about getting a fan that's louder because as time goes on, we didn't know if the PS5 as a whole was going to get louder. But it seems like they've really nipped that in the bud because while this fan is technically different, like on the surface, then if you compare it to the launch one, like this one has fins that go all the way to the center and this one doesn't, and that's what we saw in the 1100 model. It seems like this fan is running totally fine. Like Austin held his little microphone decibel reader thing up to the back of all these PS5s and there was really no difference between all 3 of them and how loud they are, which basically means that yeah, they figured out this issue with the fans. Now if only Valve could figure that out with the Steam Deck, because that's been a huge controversy there as well, where one fan is much louder than another one to the point where people are buying new fans on iFixit, taking apart their Steam Decks and putting new fans in. That's a big controversy over there, but it seems like thankfully Sony has figured this one out for themselves. I don't know what made me think of this, but after just years of cracking these things open, I was kind of expecting to find like a new chip or something like that to maybe take advantage of that DualSense Edge. You know, it's like a Pro controller and Xboxes use different radios with different Xboxes. So I kind of thought about that and was like, maybe they'll have a new chip inside this new PS5 that'll make it connect to that thing easier or remove latency or something like that. But no, it looks like everything on that front is exactly the same, which I guess is good. You don't have to worry about it performing with that new controller better. And I didn't really see anything either in this new version, the 1200, that made me say, oh, this thing will work better with the PSVR 2 than maybe the 1000 version or the 1100 will. So that's good as well. Austin and I are definitely going to take another look at this thing and see if there's another chip underneath the heatsink compared to the other 2 models, just to see if Sony is doing something different here. So if you want to check that out, make sure you're subscribed to Austin's channel and also subscribe here on PSReady. So while last year I was bummed out when I had to hear Austin say that the PS5 is worse, this year I'm happy to say that the PS5 is officially better.